I've always found Lisa's dreams to be a good starting place when trying to understand the psychological effects of travel. Lisa was a 9-year-old girl sent through the Groom Lake interface in 1975. The Groom Lake interface connects to the so-called Sister City, technically persistent locus, known as the Hanging Temples. She stayed there for 5 days of normal time, but only 48 seconds of beyond time. A marked discrepancy. Upon returning, she did not recall anything beyond becoming drowsy for a moment. She slept well that night, and in the morning she recounted a dream to the doctors, before dying later in the day. A direct transcript of the audio from her interview. It was spring, and it had been raining all day, but the rain stopped just before it was going to be sunset, so all the clouds were purpley and the sky was really orange, and the grass was all wet with rain, and there were fireflies all around, like all in the sky, way up in the sky, big ones. And me and my grandma went out to these hills way out past the edge of town, and under the hills, there were people sleeping, not in caves, they were buried under the hills. The people were asleep, but they were hugging each other. Families, like moms and dads and little kids. It would be easy to say the Soviets discovered the secrets of survivable travel, because they were more ruthless, more willing to sacrifice innocent lives. But there was really no lack of ruthlessness on the part of the CIA. It's really just a matter of approach. The Soviets approached the mystery of the flesh interfaces the same way they approached their space program. The first humans in space, the so-called lost cosmonauts who were never officially acknowledged, were just ordinary people, culled from the gulags, with no more control over their mission than Laika the dog. The Americans, on the other hand, started with professional men, usually from the military. Likewise, when it was discovered that objects and even animals which entered the flesh interfaces occasionally returned unharmed, the Americans began training men to enter the interfaces. Because they culled their men from certain military ranks, they were all of similar ages. The Soviets, however, used prisoners who had a much wider age range, and so they were able to discover the essential correlation. The younger the person was, the more likely they were to survive travel, the longer they would survive after travel. They discovered that 20-somethings were much more likely to survive, albeit in a horribly altered state, than older people. They discovered that people in their early 20s fared better than those in their late 20s. Teenagers fared even better. So, despite all moral compunction, it was really all a matter of time before they sent a child. And it was only after the first round of children went through that they gained any idea of what was on the other side. Until we found the village, we had suspected that the detectors were just props, just toys given to us by the CIA guys to reassure us. Nobody trusted the spooks. 3 days through the jungle, and these detectors had not detected a fucking thing. But before we even saw the first hut, the needles on the detectors started moving in unison. If they were phony toys, it was a cool little special effect. The needles swayed back and forth, and all the little metal boxes let out this spooky sound all in unison, like a school choir. Very weird. We turned them off. As instructed, we treated every Vietnamese as combatants, and killed them all. There wasn't any resistance, though. A few had weapons, but most were unarmed. None fought back. They didn't even run. They were just sitting around, lazing in the sun. And we shot them where we found them. Grim work, and very weird. That probably spooked us out more than the detectors. It was like they were waiting to die. After clearing the village, we didn't know what to do, so we turned on one of the detectors and wandered around to see what was up. The detector started going nuts all around one of the bigger huts in the middle of the village. We had already cleared it, but we went in again. There was a big altar inside, with candles and Buddhas and gold signs with dink writing and shit. We figured that maybe one of the Buddha statues was setting the detectors off. But no. The hut was very hot and muggy, even by the incredibly humid standards of Vietnam. It was incredibly humid in there. Even the Buddha statues were sweating. Their faces were literally coated with drops of moisture. Everybody noticed that there was something weird going with the air. There was something off about the pressure. So we just tossed everything. Picked all the shit up and tossed it out the hut. Sure enough, we picked up the big platform that held the altar. There was something under it. It was a pit made of flesh, maybe 5 feet across and going down about 20 feet before curving out of sight. When I say made of flesh, I mean it looked like the inside of somebody's throat. Wet, reddish flesh-looking stuff. We had heard of them building tunnels, but this was... We really couldn't even understand what we were looking at. I was just breathing. The flesh kind of rippled, and this hot air came out, and it felt and smelled like somebody breathing right on your face. Enough to make you sick. They told us we would know it when we saw it. Well, we saw it, and we knowed it. We radioed in the coordinates and got the fuck out of there. Encasement was certainly not something we were expecting. It really changed our whole perspective on what exactly was occurring. We thought that the flesh interfaces were just like pipes that went from one location to another, perhaps extra-dimensionally, or by some other magic. But when the first subject came back encased, we realized that... Well, I'm not sure what we realized. We realized, for the 1000th time, in our dealings with the flesh interfaces, that we were dealing with something really beyond us. That's why I called it magic. They were so far beyond our understanding. It was basically like meddling with some kind of black magic. The first subject to come back encased was an 8-year-old girl we had named Jingles. We started naming the kids dog names to try to depersonalize them, to assuage the guilt. This was done by the recommendation of the CIA psychiatrist, but it didn't work very well. We all still felt like shit. But what choice did we have? Could we just ignore the flesh interfaces and not study them? Perhaps. But you must realize that the Soviets were also studying them. That changed the whole equation. If they... Well, the ethical issues have been debated to death. What's done is done. We dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. We gave those blankets to the Indians. And we sent those kids through those portals. Now it's all just a part of history. Anyways, we sent Jingles into the flesh interface, and an object returned 2 minutes later, which is a pretty long time for an interface. It was a large, organic sac lined with veins, vaguely resembling a human lung, about 4 feet long. We x-rayed it and saw the skeleton inside and cut it open. Sure enough, Jingles was inside, naked and covered with blood, with no hair on her head. There was an umbilical cord attached to her belly button, which was attached to some sort of placenta. We had a problem with the surgeons trying to harm her. It was later realized that her blood, its blood, the blood from the sac, had high concentrations of an exotic LSD analog. It was getting absorbed through the skin. The placenta was like an LSD factory, pumping out millions of doses. This particular blend made people pretty violent, so we had to put on containment suits. Jingle's skin was flawless, like a newborn's. No wrinkles on the back of her neck, no wrinkles on her palms except the major ones. She had the form of an 8-year-old girl, but seemed a lot newer. We did MRIs on her bone plates and found that they were highly underdeveloped, as if she was a newborn. We wondered, is this really Jingles or some kind of clone? What sort of apparatus could have possibly produced this clone, and why? After a day of observation, she awoke. We weren't sure if her mind was still there. Perhaps she had been wiped clean. So we waited, asking her questions. At first, her behavior was like that of an infant, just smiling and gurgling and clasping her hands. It was pretty eerie seeing that kind of behavior from an 8-year-old girl. Really, it was pretty eerie looking at her at all. Her skin was so pure and glowing. She looked like an absolute angel. Anyways. After a while, she started babbling, saying little phrases in a matter of hours. She seemed to progress through the various stages of development, her sentence structure and awareness becoming more and more sophisticated. As soon as she could understand sentences, we started questioning her again. Who was she? She said her name. She knew her past. This wasn't just a blank clone. This may or may not have been the original girl. But she seemed to have the same mind as the original. So then we asked her the question that we wanted to know. The question that had plagued us for years. The question that had led us, in the face of all humanity and morality, to send a child into a living apparatus of death. What did you see? What's on the other side? Her expression grew thoughtful. She was such a thoughtful, bright girl. We chose her for her intelligence. So young and bright, and we just threw her. Anyways, she thought about the question, and it seemed then that we would finally get an answer. A real answer. I remember the sense of anticipation in the room. It was like nothing I've ever felt before or since. Remember, I quit the program that day. I was never able to question another subject. Anyways, she said to us, inside the chamber, I started to feel drowsy. Then everything changed. And I knew what I saw. I had seen it before. I said to myself, this is like the room in Grammy's house. The quiet room. We asked her what she meant by this. She replied with these words. Her final words before she simply stopped living and sat there dead with her eyes still on us. She said, "Come unto these yellow sands." In explaining our cruelty, which I admit was quite beyond the scope of all humanity, I feel I must remind you of how we lost the war. We lost the war in the cruelest way imaginable. Island after island fell, and the enemy drew closer and closer. More and more bombs fell on our cities. Food grew more and more scarce, people starved. House burned, people burned, children burned. We were punished by our own sense of dignity, by our own inability to admit inevitable and total defeat. It was like watching a sword slowly being sunk into your chest, millimeter by millimeter. But you refused to cry out, refused to whimper or beg for mercy. And there is nothing you can do but watch the metal disappear into your weeping flesh. By the end of 1944, it was clear that both Japan and Germany were doomed, barring some divine intervention. Yet the stories we knew from childhood told us that we had been saved by divine intervention before, when the fleets of Kublai Khan were at our shores, moving from island to island, conquering and raping, until a miraculous typhoon sent their ships to the bottom of the ocean, Though we were modern men and trained in Western science, we still believed that there was some sacred destiny in store for the Japanese people, and we kept an eye out for something, anything, which hinted of the divine. Two intriguing pieces of news had come to us via Germany, develops which suggested that perhaps the tide of war could turn suddenly. However, both were ominous. One was that America was developing a superweapon, a bomb which could level entire cities, which used the latent power of the atom, unleashing the very forces which held existence together. We assured ourselves that this was American propaganda, that no such weapon actually existed. But our scientists acknowledged that it was theoretically possible. The second piece of the news was more puzzling. It was said that a Swiss scientist had synthesized a chemical, which, like the American nuclear technology, could unleash latent forces. This time, the forces of the mind. This chemical was said to fuse the various disparate areas of the mind and allow for incredible insights. Apparently, teams working under the influence of this chemical for long periods of time were capable of inventing techniques and devices previously unheard of. By the end of 1944, various high-ranking Germans were slipping out of Germany, like rats from a sinking ship, often trying to fund their escapes by selling various pieces of artwork, technology, intelligence, etc. It was from one of these that we obtained an enormous supply of this wonder chemical, LSD, which was supposed to be secret even from Germany's allies. Along with the chemical, we were given a piece of news which was positively tantalizing, given the position we were in. According to our contact, experiments with LSD had been conducted at the Treblinka extermination camp. A group of prisoners was given the drugs for a period of several months, and the results were so impressive that somehow the prisoners were able to convince the camp leaders to take the drug as well. Soon the entire camp hierarchy was taking the drug and working together on a new device that was some sort of destructive radar, which could bring down planes as easily as ordinary radar found them. It was said to be powerful enough to slice bombers right in half. Of course, we found this news hard to believe. Nazi death camp commanders working side by side with Jewish prisoners to invent a magical radar. It was utterly fantastical. Our good sense told us to ignore it. And yet, how could we? The Americans had already taken back the Philippines. Soon they would take Iwo Jima and then Okinawa, and all the home islands. We were facing the end of the Japanese as a free race, perhaps the end of all Japanese existence. The Germans would have it easy compared to us. Many Americans were German in origin. There is a blood affinity between the two countries. This did not exist for us. The Americans would burn our cities and rape our women and enslave us, make us servants, like their Neguro. We would be bred with the whites until we had become some degenerate half-caste. Japanese culture would crumble. The stories of our childhoods would be forgotten. We were watching a sword disappear into our hearts, and we were desperate for some kind of divine intervention. So, in late 1944, a glass jar of LSD crystals, enough for several million doses, was taken aboard a submarine and slipped under the cover of the sea, back to the home islands. We were looking for divine grace. What we found was a hell beyond our darkest dreams of destruction. Hello, friends. Thank you for your interest in my post. I wanted to apologize to the community at large for posting them to threads whose relationship to their content is, at best, tangential. I simply had nowhere else to post my information where anybody would read it. Previously, I was operating a website wherein my information laid out in a rather straightforward manner. I was quite convinced that the undeniable truth of this information would attract attention on its own accord. I was quite sure that somehow this grand truth would shine out as a beacon and resonate with receptive people and quickly become widespread. As I recall, my best month brought about 400 visitors and a total of 4 non-spam comments. 75% of these recommended psychiatric intervention. So here we find ourselves. I am attempting to use the techniques of fiction and suspense to hopefully generate interest in this information. Your subreddit furthers the same, and I sincerely thank you for creating it. I should clarify that this information is not fiction, nor is it true. It is a mix of things which happened and things which almost happened. Things which were and things which could have been. You must understand that the present moment in which we exist is simply a nexus from which trillions of possible past and possible futures branch out. The important thing to realize is that these unreal past and unrealized futures are related to each other. By examining what might have been, we can come to understand what might come to be. I am writing about what has never been, and what must never be. Unfortunately, our generation has been given a special burden. We are doomed, as the apocryphal Chinese curse has it, to live in interesting times. Soon, technological advances in the field of information technology and bioengineering will fundamentally reshape human existence. There are a number of possible outcomes, and I believe that most of them will result in the human race entering unending era of absolute slavery. As a free species, we have seen totalitarianism before. We have destroyed it. But when it arises again, aided by advanced information and biological technology, it will have a new and unprecedented ability to envelop the entire Earth and place humanity in an unalterable state of total mental and physical slavery that will last for uncounted millennia, until the Earth becomes uninhabitable. Not only do I believe that this outcome is possible, I believe that it is overwhelmingly likely. Out of all the trillions of possible futures arrayed before us, 99.9999% of them result in this outcome. As Christ said, "Wide is the gate, and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But narrow is the gate, and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." We must find and enter the narrow gate, but it will not be easy. In order to find it, we must sort through the many possible paths to find the few possible futures, which result in a humanity free to live and die as humans, and not as an unholy agglomeration of mindless flesh. Unfortunately, as we fight against the forces of slavery and death, it will be precisely our instincts towards the preservation of freedom and life that will lead us to destruction. In short, we live in precarious times. I want to make clear that while this post shows clear and appalling signs of megalomania, I am actually aware that I am not a prophet or an expert. I am a 30-something American male without the benefit of a college education or a stable job. Sadly, I have spent most of my life drunk. My post will contain a number of historical errors, both intentional and unintentional, as well as bad spelling, bad grammar, and laughably overwrought prose. Readers with a proper education will easily see through my attempts at erudition. In short, I have no proper formal qualifications for the task I have set out for myself. But I have personally experienced the intellectual mutations of which I write. Through repeated self-experimentation, I have fractured the time state of my brain, and now it exists in an ever-shifting state between various past which didn't happen. As such, I have been given what I believe is a special insight into our possible futures. They are dark. The shadows of the past atrocities pass and overlap with the shadows of future atrocities. Time is short. Recently, I have been beset with a persistent creativity that seems to grow stronger as the days go by. I fear this state is unsustainable. Perhaps eventually this productive mania will turn into an unproductive psychosis. And soon, on a larger scale, mankind's productivity will turn into its own sort of psychosis. Billions of years ago, the so-called primordial soup arranged itself into a self-replicating form, which multiplied and flourished, and divaricated into countless species. From our vantage point in the present, this singular moment of origin has become lost in the mists of time. Equally obscure to us is the future singularity towards which we are heading. The endpoint, which all the countless species are once again reintegrated into a new and singular form. A new abomination. We are on the verge, all of us. Times are dire. We are about to be gathered again into the arms of the Mother, to become one flesh with her. The Mother who gathers lost children. The Mother I have seen in dark spaces since I was a little child. Back when I called her the Mother with horse eyes. We are about to meet her again. We are about to be unborn. When you're hanging out with the tribe of Nazi acid heads, magical space pussy doesn't even register on the weirdo meter. I mean, they talk about so much weird shit, and so much of it was total bullshit that I didn't pay any fucking attention to it. It was the 60s. Talking about magical space pussies was like asking somebody how their day went. It was just conversation to me. But to them, it wasn't. That was a strange time in my life. I'd spent the last 6 months going from commune to commune, just checking them out. They were all bullshit. Every one of them was just some guy on a power trip and a bunch of women who'd grown up with bad fathers hanging on his every word, hoping he would solve all their problems. That's the only way the commune system worked. The guy got control of the women, and the women attracted a few guys to the manual labor. But in the end, it was basically just a new system of pimping. I mean, I'm from Brooklyn. I've seen pimping. These chicks had tried to escape society, and just gotten themselves pimped out. It was tragic. But not too tragic for me to give a shit about it. So I went out to Death Valley. Why did I go there? Why does anybody? Because it has a cool name. If it was called some scorpions and a bunch of fucking rocks, which is what it actually is, nobody would go. I had decided I was done with counterculture. I was done with the regular culture. I was done with it all. I would go where no one would bother me, and just try to figure myself out. Get a little peace and quiet. A month later, the Mason family moved in next door. For a while, it was just a nice little guy named Paul and some girls living a few miles from my little shack. Seemed harmless. Then the whole family came in. Charlie, too. They had already committed the murders at this point. It was big news, but nobody knew who did it. I surely didn't connect it to the band of weirdos next door. They seemed too stupid to pull off anything newsworthy. Just another bullshit commune. Once Charlie got there, the family seemed to spend most of their time driving their dune buggies around, pretending to be the fucking Africa Corps. I mean, Charlie would put a helmet on with a swastika and lead them in maneuvers. I had never met a racist Nazi hippie before. There was a first time for everything. Some of them even talked about Uncle Adolf and how he knew the score, how he should have won the war. I was a mechanic in the army, so I helped them out with the buggies and got to know them a little. Slowly, their little philosophy trickled down onto me. They thought America was on the verge of an apocalyptic race war. Blacks on white, helter-skelter, the Watts riot in every city. That part actually seemed pretty plausible. I mean, you have to understand, in 1969 the country had been getting weirder and weirder, more and more violent every year. Nobody was quite sure when it would end. Nobody knew that in the 70s, the counterculture would just kinda peter into a bunch of fucking James Taylor albums. They said that they had come to the desert to find a hideout so they would be safe while the helter-skelter race war was going on. They said that somewhere out in the desert there was a bottomless pit full of wonders and treasures. In the Bible, Revelation speaks of the tree of life, which bears 12 kinds of fruit, one for every month. They said this tree was growing inside the bottomless pit and would give them all the food they wanted while they waited out the war. When it was over, they said, they would emerge and Charlie would rule the world as the new Christ. So that part was a little less plausible. And then I started hearing about the magical space vagina. I had become friends with Paul, who was actually a nice guy who just wanted to fuck the girls and get stoned, and didn't really get into the whole Nazi thing. He said that they were searching for the entrance to the bottomless pit. He said that entrance would be made of flesh, growing out of the rocks. Like a giant pussy, so big you could stroll right in. I told him he thought about pussy way too much. But he was serious. He said that the technology to turn rocks into flesh was from outer space, and its secrets had been taught to Charlie by Uncle Adolf. Until then, I thought that Uncle Adolf was their name for Hitler. Slowly, I learned more. I started to realize that they were talking about somebody who was still alive. Somebody they actually knew. They told me he was coming soon. This kind of psychological mirroring was exploited in the design of the flesh interfaces. When a human body is embedded in an interface, the independent, i.e. non-human, interface glands produce massive amounts of LSD, which cause intellectual mutations, i.e. time fracturing along several dozen axes. Meanwhile, independent hormone regulators produce an emotional oscillation between two states, euphoria and terror. Thus we have the typical sound of an interface, altering waves of giggling and screaming that move through the interface population, running along the length of the interface as the hormones travel along the independent conduits. These successive waves of giggling and screaming create a steady rhythm that washes over the traveler as they move through the interface. Neutral empathetic responses, mirroring, prepare the traveler's body for the process of embrace. When I was little, they took Mommy away, put me with new Mommy in a smelly dark house. They said she was a real person, but I knew she wasn't. They had made her. Her face was made from pieces of animal. Pig cheeks, hairy goat jaw, old horse eyes. They sewed her together badly, and the seams were crusty. I hated her. Real Mommy called me from underground. I opened the attic window at sundown and let the spring breeze flow in. I heard her song floating on the cool air. Soft singing from the grave. Watching the flesh interface process known as embrace is kind of like watching those Japanese subway groping videos. That was honestly the first thing I thought of when I watched it. But of course I wasn't going to put that in the official report. You ever seen those videos? Oh, you wouldn't admit it if you had, right? It's a whole genre over there. Not the most progressive stuff in terms of gender equality, but compelling nonetheless. The video starts with a woman standing in the subway, minding her own business, when some guy starts feeling her up. She protests demurely and attempts to deflect his roaming hands. He persists. Other men on the subway, perhaps sensing her weakness, joined in the groping. A sort of group madness takes over the subway occupants. The men are transformed from ordinary travelers into agglomerated masses of arms and hands and fingers, grabbing every part of the woman's body. The woman's attempts at protecting her personal space are always absurdly ineffectual, and soon she is divested of her clothing. Depending on the video subgenre, a variety of acts ensues, most of which surely violate local transportation statutes. Embrace is kind of like that. That, combined with a school of piranhas stripping a live cow of its flesh.